And welcome back. This is part 2 of Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality. Nietzsche opens this second essay pointing out that man is an animal, albeit a special animal, one with the right to make promises. And he sets promises up in contrast to forgetfulness. Forgetfulness is described as a positive faculty of repression. It's an important quality to have because it allows us to keep a certain psychic order. With things like the slave revolt in morality, the creation of human memories, and the aesthetic ideal, which Nietzsche will talk about in the third essay. Nietzsche believes that man was better off without these things happening to us. It's because we have them now, however, that we must try to overcome them, to evolve past them. He explains that man stands in security of his own future. Once we gained power over ourselves and our fate, that is what was first known as a conscience. Survival in nature, a dominance over all the other animals. And he goes back to memories, and how memories first began, and how remarkable it is that humans have this faculty for memory, considering how powerful and important forgetfulness is for a being. He believes that painful occurrences were burned into man's early consciousness. Terrible deeds, human sacrifices, public executions perhaps perpetrated by the masters, punishment to tell people not to do a certain thing, and that's how they first began remembering things. Indeed, I think you'll agree with me that the most powerful memories are painful ones. The creation of memory also lent itself to the formation of rationality, the cleverness in the slave class, resulting of course in the slave revolt and morality, which I talked about in the last video. Nietzsche moves on to talk about guilt. Guilt comes from debts, the act of doing something wrong, and a lingering feeling of wrongness when that act cannot be taken back. To Nietzsche, you cannot feel guilty. It just isn't possible if you don't feel like you've done something wrong. And speaking of debts, there are always debtors and creditors, people who are owed and people who owe. Justice began, to Nietzsche, not paying back what was fair, but with what the master class could get away with. So think of someone giving some advance credit to someone else, and that thing has failed to be returned. That someone, the creditor, is allowed to do as he pleases with the debtor, as was agreed upon, to vent power on one who is powerless. A compensation for a failure to be paid back. With blood, sometimes. With all the suffering going on, people went crazy trying to rationalize it. It was the senselessness that got to them. So they invented God as a way to say, all of our suffering will be paid back in the afterlife. It will have all been worth it. Some central concepts in religion spring from senseless suffering, paybacks, returns, the idea of mercy and forgiveness, how they're a form of power because no matter what the creditor does, the debtor could still be saved by God. The debtor's suffering will be paid for. And all this punishment in prehistory is what first awakened man's guilt, his bad conscience. And Nietzsche believes that punishment doesn't improve a man, it just tames him. See, bad conscience and guilt came from society, from man turning inward for the first time. He's outside of nature. He's built a wall for himself. There's introspection going on. Bad conscience is something Nietzsche describes as an illness, but one that he challenges modern man to overcome. A human animal is against itself, pregnant with the future and awareness. And so Nietzsche views man as a bridge, not an end to itself. This is Nietzsche's concept of the overman, the next step in human evolution that could be achieved through non-dogmatic philosophy and throwing out all these outdated ideas of morality. Nietzsche believed that this was the future, and the audience he's always addressing are future philosophers. He considers reverence for God as the constantly growing debt between the present generation and its ever-increasing ancestry, who we are indebted to for surviving and bearing us like some sort of deity. And so Nietzsche thinks that religious people are sick because of their belief that their suffering is going to be paid back in the afterlife, that they're going to be rewarded and compensated for all the bad things that have happened to them. Because they think that their guilt cannot be solved on their own, that God must do it, and Nietzsche regards God as non-existent, then you see the problem here. Bad conscience is an illness, like he said, a certain type of illness. Like the way you might be able to view pregnancy as an illness. It's basically horrible to be pregnant. You have 9 months where you're going through all these hormonal changes, and you ostensibly have a parasite feeding on you. You feel weighed down and heavier than you've ever been before. But people get pregnant all the time because they believe that all that suffering is justified because they get to have a child. The suffering associated with the pregnancy doesn't matter because it's such a beautiful thing to have a child. With bad conscience, man is pregnant with a suffering that will never turn into anything useful. It will just remain suffering. So just think about being pregnant all the time. And since Nietzsche doesn't believe in God, these people are electing to remain that way without the benefits of having a child afterwards. They go through their entire lives like this. So to Nietzsche, they're sick. mentally ill, as it were, unhinged. Man should not be irredeemable to himself. We should not deny our true nature, because God can't take that away from us, especially if he doesn't exist. In fact, Nietzsche figures that man created God for himself. But he ponders, how can we overcome bad conscience? How do we take suffering, relentless and senseless suffering, and channel it and make it something useful? Stay tuned tomorrow for the next essay where I'll lay a conjecture down for you. If you guys want to get updates when I'm doing more philosophy videos, please subscribe. See you tomorrow, future philosophers.